What's up, students? Thank you so much for tuning in today and making your group a priority this week. My name's Cody, and I'm the student pastor here. Man, I'm praying that your group has been just a blessing in your life so far, as we are a solid month into home groups. And so Rachel kicked off our new series on friendship at Block Party last week, and then Pastor Graham talked about how the friends you choose impact the future you have. And we'll discover that the people you choose to be friends with have deeper levels of influence in your life. Some of them are good, and maybe for some of you, there are some bad influences that you have in your life. And for our discussion today, there's a really important tension that we're going to be talking about and try to learn how to manage well. And I tell you that because I don't want us to shy away from it because things get a little fuzzy and it's hard, but I want us to press into that because it's very real for all of us and it's not something we should ignore. And so today we're going to talk about the concept of unfriending people and really taking an honest look at who we are allowing to have influence in our life, what types of influence our friends should have. Because the Bible says in 1 Corinthians 15:33, do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. And see, guys, there's a real need to make sure that our inner circle of friends that we allow to have the most influence in our life are people that are not bad company, because that can corrupt our good character, and namely, it will affect our desire to follow Jesus and honor him with our life. And I'm sure as you look back on parts of your life where you've gotten into some trouble, there's a pretty good chance that most of the time you got in trouble, you weren't alone, right? Almost every time I got in trouble, it was because I was being egged on to do something I shouldn't do, or I was the one egging on someone else to do something that they shouldn't do. And I remember this specific time when I was back in high school, I got into some pretty big trouble, and I won't lie. Back in high school, I was a rule follower and a bit of a little goody two-shoes, and there's nothing wrong with that, but some of my best friends at the time weren't really rule followers, and they weren't really following Jesus. Now, I was spending the night at a buddy's house, and he convinced me that we should sneak out. And that's what we did. And now we didn't do anything stupid or crazy, I promise, but I did turn off my phone and leave it at his house so my parents couldn't track me. Well, when I pulled into the neighborhood at 1 a.m., I see this car turn on their lights and begin following me. And I'm looking in the mirror and it hits me, man, those are my dad's headlights. And right then in that moment, I knew that I was busted. We pulled up to my friend's house. My dad yells at me to get back in the car and go home. And so I get home and I walk through the door. My mom's sitting in the living room with that lamp next to her, like right out of a movie scene. I got in so much trouble and was grounded for such a long time. But the truth is that I wouldn't have done that if my friend didn't convince me and influence me to do so. And for some of you, I think you can think of times where your friends have maybe influenced you to do something bad that you wouldn't normally do. Students, there is a real need for us to be wise about the friends we choose, because it's impossible to live the right life when you have the wrong friends. Think about this. I'm sure we can all think of ways that we've wanted to grow in our relationship with Jesus, but that can be hard to do with some of the friends that we have, right? Sometimes we have to change up our friends in order to live the right life by following Jesus. But here's where that tension that we were talking about earlier comes into play. It's a tension of potentially taking a step back from some friendships. It's a tension of learning how to do that well. It's a tension about being wise with the friends that you choose, but also recognizing that Jesus calls us to be a light and to love everyone. But to stop being someone's friend doesn't feel very loving. And here's how I know how to manage that tension best, and this comes straight from what Jesus did. You ready? Jesus loved everyone equally, but he gave time and attention differently to other people. Think about that for a second, right? We know that Jesus loved everybody. He loved sinners. He was always around tax collectors and prostitutes and people that were outcasts of their society, and Jesus loved them well. But on the flip side, he did not give everyone the same time and attention, right? He called only his 12, and of those 12, he spent more time with his 3, and Jesus constantly withdrew from large crowds. He kept the Pharisees at an arm's length. Jesus is the perfect example of how to love everyone, but yet things can look different with how much time and attention you give to people. And so today we're going to be diving into 3 things that real friends stand for with one another. First, friends shouldn't distract you from God's plan. Friends shouldn't distract you from what God has in store for you. This is something Jesus took very seriously. And there's a story in Matthew 16 where Jesus is telling his disciples that the cross is coming, that he must go and he's going to suffer and all these terrible things are going to be happen. And Peter stands up and actually begins to rebuke Jesus, which I don't know why in the world Peter thought that he had the authority to do so. But he says, Lord, this should never happen to you. And Jesus responds in Matthew 16:23, says, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are a stumbling block to me. You do not have God's concerns in mind, but merely human concerns." You see, Jesus knew that the cross was God's plan. He knew that that was his mission and what he was called to do. He knew that he needed to go to the cross. And although we can see the good intentions that Peter had, he didn't want the Messiah and his friend to die. But that was distracting him from what God had in store for him. That distracted him from God's plan. And so students, we shouldn't let our friends distract us from God's plan. In fact, it's usually quite the opposite. When we get distracted, they should restore us on the right path and remind us of God's plan that he has for our lives. And so do your friends distract you from God's plan, or do they remind you of his plan? Second thing is this: friends shouldn't continually tempt you to sin. Real friends shouldn't be tempting you to sin. You and I as Christ followers are called to refrain from sin and to set boundaries so that we don't fall into that temptation. I love the story of Joseph for this story, literally fleeing from sin. You know, Joseph was in a high position of power in Egypt, was Potiphar's right-hand man, but when Potiphar was out of his house, his wife would try to get Joseph to sleep with her. And that has bad news written all over it. But look what happens in Genesis 39:12. It says, Potiphar's wife caught him, Joseph, by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. You know, she's tempting him, in all honesty, pretty forcefully into sin. And what does Joseph do? He literally flees and runs away. He runs away from the temptation of sin. And so students, are your friends tempting you to sin, or are they encouraging you and helping you run away from temptation? Because real friends will help you fight the sin that is in your life, flee from temptation, and run towards Jesus, blocking out all other temptations and distractions. And the last one, and it's one of the more positive ones, is this: real friends, and that includes you, love people with the unconditional love of Christ. This goes back to managing that tension we were talking about earlier. We may change our close circle of friends and who we allow to have influence in our life, but we don't stop loving people. As a Christian, you can't stop loving people. Jesus says in John 13:35 that they will know you are my disciples by the way that you love one another. And even if you choose to step away from some friendships, you can't stop loving them. That would be the worst thing that you can do. And that's when people begin to look at Christians as religious snobs because we're too high and mighty for some people, or we're too good for those other people. Remember, Jesus was a friend of sinners. He didn't unfriend them, he loved them. We can't stop loving people. And for many of you, this is where that tension of this entire discussion lies, of how to continue loving people that you need to take a step back from as a friendship with. And maybe you're watching this video and you're thinking, you don't have friends that encourage you in these ways. Well, I got good news. Look to your left. Now look to your right. There are people all around the room that you're in who are in the same boat as you are. And y'all can remind each other of God's plan, help each other flee from sin, and encourage each other to love people with the unconditional love of Christ. Remember, it is impossible to live the right life when you have the wrong friends. And now you're going to talk about this more in your small groups, but before that, we have a couple of announcements that we want to make sure that you know about.
Thanks for joining us. There are a few things happening in PTSM that we want to make sure you're in the loop for. Coming up, we have a girls' night. It's on October 29th on Saturday. Join us for a night full of worship and messages, community, and crafts for all of us girls in PTSM, both middle school and high school. Also, remember that HIGHDEF registration opens on October 23rd. Sign up within the first 48 hours for a PTSM swag pack. For more information and to sign up for these events, go to prestontrail.org/events. Thanks again for tuning in, and remember, if you're touring a cheese factory in South Dakota, remember to grab an energy drink before you get there. Falling asleep amongst the cheddar is 100% illegal. The more you know. Have a good one.